Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is February 11th, 2024, and let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? Let's go on the map updates first, and there's a lot of things to cover, and mostly it's not really looking good for the Ukraine forces in Donbass, and we know that, first of all, the biggest battle right now that is ongoing is in Avdiivka, and it still continues to be the case. So unfortunately, right now, the Russians are having a good amount of success, and they're pushing more and more towards the center of Avdiivka. You can see that the Russians now have divided this in kind of two pockets. They've managed to breach through in the middle of Avdiivka, so they have one pocket to the east of the city and another smaller one in the west. And also you can see that they've managed to push a little bit north of Avdiivka, kind of the center between Stepova and Avdiivka. So there is a breakthrough here. And this is very serious because you can see that they have managed to take a few blocks under their control. Again, these buildings here and everything in Avdiivka is ruined. There's no real standing building anymore. And you can see that the Russians have crossed this railway line that divides the city in half, and they're getting awfully close to that last road that connects Avdiivka, basically from the south of the city, the main city center, to the north of the city of Avdiivka. There's still another road that the Ukrainians can use to resupply its forces. You can see that it's this one that goes through Lastochkine, but this is the main one that the Ukrainians are using. So this is very critical at this current situation that we're looking at. And so a serious decision will have to be made by Syrskyi, who's the new commander-in-chief, whether the Ukraine forces should pull out in the next few days. The latest, a few weeks. I mean, the trend clearly shows, and I've been talking about it for the last few weeks as well, that most likely the Ukrainians will have to retreat from Avdiivka, unless there is a counteroffensive here, which doesn't seem to be the case because the Ukrainians are lacking ammunition to be able to conduct an operation that would drive out the Russians out of Avdiivka, at least for a few kilometers away. So I don't think that's going to happen. So clearly within the next few weeks, the Ukrainians will have to retreat from Avdiivka unless something happens. That's the unfortunate truth. Again, the good positive side, the silver lining of this is that this has costed the Russians such a massive amount of resources, manpower, and resources in terms of vehicles that the Russians have lost in Avdiivka for almost 5 months has been tremendous. They've lost over 500, closer to 600 vehicles, and that continues to be the case day by day. And the only saving grace for the Ukrainians, where they're able to continue fighting, we know it, is because of the sheer massive scale of drones that the Ukrainians are able to produce. Drones will not replace artillery. Let's confirm that. It's not the case. It's not the panacea to defeating the Russians, but it certainly is very useful and very precise. And the Ukrainians have utilized small drones, bigger drones, doesn't matter what type of drones, to great effects, especially in Avdiivka, and also other battlefields. Also Novomykhailivka, I've talked about it, where a Russian column was defeated here about a week and a half ago. So the Ukrainians are utilizing these drones to great effects, but they're missing that artillery, that ammunition, the missiles, the bombs necessary to not only hold the line, but being able to do an offensive of their own. It takes a tremendous amount of resources, which Ukraine unfortunately is not getting from its allies because they are fighting amongst each other, unfortunately. So that's the situation for Avdiivka. And also, speaking of Novomykhailivka, the Russians, even though they were defeating in that, a week ago, I've talked about it, that massive Russian column that was destroyed. You can see that Deep State updated the map here in Novomykhailivka, which is a very small village by itself, but the Russians have entered parts of Novomykhailivka as well. So again, this is another consolidation that the Russians are trying to do here, kind of level out the battle line here in Novomykhailivka. So the situation here isn't looking good unless the Ukrainians are able to drive out the Russians and, reestablish their positions. So that's the situation around Avdiivka and its general area. Again, the Russians are also trying to push around Marinka, continue on pressing forward. So there's a lot of offensives right now in the greater area of Donetsk city. The Russians are really trying to push out the Ukrainian presence out of their main capital, Donetsk, which is the default capital of the Russian DPR, LNR or LPR Republic, the capital of Donbass, as the Russians see it. So they absolutely need to continue driving out the Ukrainians out of the capital. So that's the situation in Avdiivka. Now let's head north, because that's the other main sort of offensive that the Russians are also conducting, is also in the north of Donetsk. We have Bakhmut. Actually, the Ukrainians were able to drive out the Russians a little bit further away from the heights of Klishivka in the last few days, so that's positive. So the Russians tried to retake Klishivka and Avdiivka. So far, they haven't been able to, but there's a lot of pressure right now by the Russians in this direction. And also, there's a lot of pressure in the north of Bakhmut. Right now, you can see that the Russians are pressing forward towards Bogdanivka. They've retaken certain positions that they've had north of Bakhmut, and now they're trying to press further and further out of Bakhmut towards Chasiv Yar, which is another Ukrainian stronghold for now. So you can see that the Russians have taken some positions in Hrumove, south of Bogdanivka. And the main, I think, attack will also be towards Ivanivske, right? They're trying to consolidate all these positions, these fields here, and then threaten Ivanivske, which is very important for the Ukrainians to hold the line in the south. So again, shortage of ammunition for the Ukrainians is causing a lot of issues right now in different front lines. When we're heading towards north of Bakhmut, there's also a lot of Russian pressure right now in the area of Kremina. You can see that here is, there's less successes by the Russians, but the Russians have been fighting in the forests of Kremina and the outskirts for many, many months without any real success. And to be fair, the same was for the Ukrainians, where they were on the offensive here. It was very, very difficult for the Ukrainians to drive out the Russians, especially in the forested areas, because Kremina is full of very dense forests. So it makes it very complicated when you have well dug in positions on both sides. So this is less fluid here because you have more forested areas in this in this general direction towards Kremina. And the last kind of thrust right now that the Russians will probably initiate is in Kupiansk. The Russians recently have taken Khrumalne and Tabaivka, two villages that are south of Kupiansk. And most likely, again, the Russians will try to consolidate their positions here around Kislivka and Kotlyarivka. So they're going to try to take these two small little hamlets or villages and then do push towards Kupiansk, or try to do push towards Kupiansk, and at the same time do an offensive towards Sinkivka, which obviously they continue doing right now with less forces, but it's very, very possible that in the next few weeks they might bring up enough troops to do two pushes towards Sinkivka and one towards the south of Kupiansk around this area of Kislivka. So overall, the situation is clear, still favorable for the Russian forces. And again, we know why. The Russians do not have any issues with their alliances. They're reliable. They have North Korea, they have China, they have Iran, they have many other countries supporting Russia indirectly or directly by providing lethal weaponry, and millions of them, right? North Korea most recently has sent another batch of 1 million shells and different types of ammunition to Russia. Even if 50% of these, this aids or these ammunition and shells are functional, that is still a massive boost for the Russian military. Additionally, Russia has an overwhelming manpower advantage. An article came out today talking about the Nepalese government asking Russia to stop recruiting in Nepal. And Russia clearly is doing this with impunity, and they don't have any real consequences to face, because Russia is not playing fair game in this war, obviously. Russia is recruiting the worst of the worst, whether it be mercenaries in Africa, prisoners in Russia, and overall, the lowest of the lowest that you can find, people that are just willing to get paid and kill. And now in Nepal, there's been 15,000 Nepalese people that have been recruited into the Russian military. They're currently fighting in Ukraine. And that's what the Nepalese government is asking Russia to stop this. They've also been recruiting Somalians in Africa, soldiers from Sierra Leone, just basically going to poor countries and recruiting people with the promise of good pay, right? So that is a serious issue. Obviously, Ukraine can't do that. And Ukraine can only rely on volunteers from all around the world, but clearly not at the same level compared to Russia. There's not going to be the same amount of soldiers from Colombia or England or Canada coming to Ukraine voluntarily. So that is a real issue. And also the fact that Ukraine hasn't yet started a second wave of mobilization, which it absolutely needs to refresh its troops, give some breathing room for these brigades that have been fighting for months in all these different directions, whether it be in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka. There's been very little rotations. And Ukraine needs a new wave of mobilization. So Zelensky needs to get this plan implemented and get it going as soon as possible. And obviously, again, we're going to talk about the lack of reliable alliances, mainly the United States, which has been fighting and eating itself for the last few months with endless debates whether they should provide assistance to Ukraine or not. And one thing that is very worrisome, which will bring me to the big headlines of today, is obviously Trump and his statements at one of his rallies yesterday, basically encouraging Russian aggression against allies. And this is a direct quote from Trump in his rally, which, it broke my heart to hear this, and so many Americans cheering in the background saying, pretty much approving what he said. Now he says, one of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills. So this is a direct statement from Trump, basically saying that if Russia invades Europe, then he would be not only okay with that, but he would even encourage the Russians to continue because, well, the Europeans didn't pay their fair share to NATO. Fair enough. Let's say that this is true. And I understand that there's a lot of disgruntled American politicians about the fact that, the United States has been really maintaining NATO as an alliance. But I think Europe recently has shown its commitment into starting to pay its fair share into NATO. And I think we've seen an increase of production by Europe, such as Germany, France, England, Denmark. Many countries right now are really starting to understand the threat that Russia poses again, and they've started reinvesting back into NATO. But they can't obviously, increase it by 10, 20% within the year. So I understand that there may be some, frustration from the Americans, but absolutely abandoning your allies, your biggest allies, is just treason of the greatest proportions. And Trump is only emboldening the Russian people into making them think that it's fine if they invade Europe. After all, Europe didn't pay its fair share into NATO, so they deserve to be invaded by Russians, right? And that's only going to embolden them to think it's normal that they'll start World War III. Because clearly, if Russia attacks the Baltics, I have very little doubt that NATO will say we won't, attack back, or we won't step in as well. So you're literally inviting World War III into Europe again. It's very, very, very scary. And Trump, honestly, at this point, following this statement is a danger to America, but not only the United States, but the entire global security order that's been fought by generations since World War I to bring back democracy, bring back freedom into Europe, and stop these insane wars between nations. And now you see one of the biggest traitors, not only to America, but to Europe, basically, or to the entire world, embolden other dictatorships to invade. So I'll let you guys think about it. Let me know in the comment section what you think about Trump's comments in his rally. I believe it was yesterday. And, I'm personally very disappointed. And I think it's treason of the highest order by a former US president who could very well be reelected this year. So I hope that the Republican voters will think twice before they decide to, vote for Trump in 2024 just because they want to see the Republican Party win, right? But that will have serious consequences for the future, without a doubt. So that's the video for today, guys. I hope you enjoy my update. Please subscribe to my channel if you enjoy my content. Like my video, leave me a comment, and I will see you guys in the next one. Slava Ukraini!